Dick Rowland was a 19-year-old African-American man who started shining shoes at the local pool hall on 3rd and Main. At the time, shoe shines cost a dime, and a good shoe shine could make upwards of $10 a day. Dick Rowland wore a nice suit, large amounts of cash, and wore a diamond ring and an outgoing personality that fit heavily with his shoe shine employment. So on May 31st, 1921, Dick Rowland was on his way to the Drexel building, which was closed because it was a Memorial Day holiday. But the building had something that very few buildings had downtown, a colored restroom on the top floor. So as Rowland walked into the elevator, he met 17-year-old Sarah Page, who was operating the elevator. Reports differed from what happened next and has been a source of endless speculation. But after Rowland entered the elevator, at some point, Sarah Page would scream, and the clerk at the front desk of the Drexel building would rush over as he saw Rowland flee. The clerk then called the police. Now, some say Sarah was a prostitute and Rowland was her pimp. Others claim that they were lovers, but the widely accepted version is that the two were simply strangers and Rowland tripped, grabbed her arm, and she screamed. Whatever happened in the elevator, what is known is that the police were notified that Rowland had attempted to sexually assault Page, and initially the police were skeptical. In 1946, the police commissioner at the time, James Addison, stated that he had requested a quietly conducted investigation, but common sense alone should cast doubt on the rape claim. Only a black man with a death wish would try to rape a white woman in broad daylight in an office building in a major downtown thoroughfare. Still, it was Tulsa, 1921. Simply the idea of a black man raping a white woman, no matter the evidence, would trigger an instant reaction. By the following day, the city had gotten word of the incident and police feared issues. So the police sent 2 officers, Henry Pack and Henry Carmichael, to arrest Rowland. This served 2 roles. It showed that they were serious about their investigation, and 2, to protect him from reprisals. As word of the arrest made its way downtown, the Tulsa Tribune released its first edition that day with the headline stating that nabbed the Negro for attacking girl in the elevator. Rowland's guilt or innocence was besides the point. He had been arrested and the headline assumed guilt. The article had Tulsa buzzing and talk of a lynching had spread like wildfire. The chief of police, John Gustafson, moved Rowland from the city jail to the county jail on 6 because it was more secure. Coincidentally, it was the same jail that Roy Belton had been lynched from only 8 months earlier. Additionally, the Tribune didn't explicitly mention lynching, but African Americans in Tulsa would claim that another editorial stated to lynch a Negro tonight. It's possible that the article simply didn't exist, or it had gone defunct, and afterwards anything from May 31st had been destroyed, with only the Tribune's headline being the lone survivor. Either way, the Tribune's headline was more than enough to light an already short fuse. So by 3:30, the new police chief received a phone call stating that the Negro was to be lynched. By 4 o'clock, Tulsa had a dangerous combination of forces of a black man in jail, a newspaper making irresponsible claims, and a city with a history of mob justice. The police commissioner advised the sheriff to take Rowland out of town, but he completely refused. As Tulsa made their way home, a crowd began to gather around the courthouse, and 3 men entered the building and demanded Rowland. They spoke to the sheriff and said, "There's been talk of a lynching, but you might as well go home because no one's going to get to this Negro." The men simply left. The sheriff instructed his deputies to disable the elevator and station them behind the door at the top of a narrow staircase, which was the only way in or out. John Gustafson would make few trips back and forth to the courthouse between 7:30 and 9 p.m. As time went on, the angry white mob diminished and only left a group of curiosity seekers. It appeared as if the worst was over. However, the news from the Tribune and the possibility of a lynching had galvanized the black community in Tulsa. The community had decided that no black man was going to be lynched on their watch. I.H. Spears, a black lawyer in Tulsa, would later state that every time I heard of a lynching, it made me want to go buy more ammunition. While the general consensus was that the lynching had to be stopped, arguments arose on exactly how that would work, with younger, more militant African Americans rounding up weapons and ammunition, prepping for a battle, while older African Americans attempt to avert a destructive confrontation that would cost them the most. After O.W. Gurley had learned of a possible lynching around 4 p.m., he walked to the courthouse and spoke to the sheriff. The sheriff assured Gurley that there would be no lynching as long as I'm sheriff, and as long as you keep your folks away from here, there won't be any trouble. Gurley attempted to explain to the group. The more militant among them called him a liar and stated that a white man had been pulled out of that same jail only a few months earlier, and they're going to take Rowland too. However, Gurley would continue to appeal to the crowd, and it worked. The crowd dispersed. Around 6:30 that night, another group convened with J.B. Stratford and a man by the name of A.J. Smitherman. Stratford instructed the group to go to the courthouse only if Rowland's life was in danger or the sheriff called for help. They didn't want violence to spiral out of control and also realized that there was very little margin for error. But at 9:15, a group of 25 armed African Americans arrived at the courthouse. McCullough stood on top and told them to go home. You're going to get a lot of people hurt. And that they had no business parading around with guns like that. One of the black men told him that we're going to go home when we get that Negro boy that you want to lynch. McCullough told them that nobody's getting lynched and that he wasn't going to be charged, and the girl had to admit it that he had done him no harm. McCullough then explained to the group that they couldn't release Rowland to the angry mob or a group of armed black citizens, so the group decided to leave. But this is the moment in events where the white mob turned from a lynching to now they felt that they needed to protect themselves from a potential black onslaught. As an armed group of blacks had just come into their part of town, and if they came back, they wanted to be fully prepared. So some of the mob went to their homes and others headed to the armory. Around 9 p.m., Major James Bell of the 180th Infantry called the police and the sheriff, but was assured that they could handle the situation. So the commanding officers of 3 National Guard units still prepared to leave the next day for Tulsa and ordered the National Guard members in Tulsa to report to the armory. Shortly thereafter, 400 whites showed up to the armory demanding rifles and guns, and they were explained that the armory was for guardsmen only and ordered them to leave. Around 10 p.m., a contingency of 75 blacks made their way to the courthouse again. The black group heard of further reports of whites attempting to storm the courthouse, and they were determined to get Rowland out of that courthouse. So the group once again confronted Sheriff McCullough. McCullough told them that Rowland was safe. He told them that parading around with guns and said violence is easy to start, but hard to stop. He told them to look at the window on the top floor, and they would cut down any attempt to take over this courthouse. Now go home before you get a lot of people shot. And as the group of blacks attempted to back off, a white man approached one of the members of the group and said, "Nigga, what are you doing with that pistol?" He replied, "I'm going to use it if I need to." Then a struggle ensued and a shot was fired in the air. And with that, all hell broke loose. The outnumbered group of blacks scattered down the street, ran to reach Greenwood, which was about 7 blocks away in the midst of a hail of bullets. A few members of both sides lay dead or dying in the streets. Some other groups did reach Greenwood where they felt they had familiar ground or some reinforcements. Near the courthouse on 4th, an ambulance showed up and attempted to help some of the injured men, but a group of whites ordered the ambulance not to touch any other black men because they came here looking for trouble and he better get going or he was going to join them. Naturally, the ambulance left. Skirmishes continued downtown as the rest of the black group attempted to race back to Greenwood in a desperate retreat. The white mob turned into rioters after being denied guns at the armory, and the group armed themselves with guns from sporting goods stores, pawn shops, and hardware stores in downtown Tulsa. Not only did they steal pistols and shotguns and ammunition, but they also stole jewelry, leather goods, and clothes. The mob stole more than $43,000. White Tulsans believed that this was a black insurrection and an invasion of downtown Tulsa by blacks hell-bent on conquering the white inhabitants. The phrase Negro Uprising was used often in National Guard reports, and one National Guard even referred to blacks as the enemy. Unlike other riots in which citizens worked outside or against the law, the police department legitimized the riot by deputizing the group of men to patrol the streets between the black and white sections of town. They gave the men badges, ribbons, and guns, and others were commissioned as special deputy sheriffs. Walter White, who was the assistant secretary for the NAACP, was actually among some of the men deputized. Because he had blonde hair and blue eyes, he could easily pass for white and travel throughout the South writing investigations about lynching. He had arrived in Tulsa just in time to be deputized at town hall and said that he was only asked 3 questions: my name, my age, and my address. He would explain later that I might have been a thug or a murderer or escaped convict. None of that mattered because my skin was white and that was enough. Afterwards, he was deputized and told, now go out and shoot a nigger because the law is behind you. Shortly after the riot begun, Governor James Brooks Ayers Robertson was told of the unrest and reached out to Police Chief Gustafson, but was assured they had the situation under control as to not look helpless in front of the governor. But shortly after the shooting started, he called Major Bell at the armory and asked him to dispatch local National Guard to clear the streets of Negroes. In the early hours of the riot, white Tulsans were massing a large enough force just to deter the blacks from Greenwood. The police deputized citizens and Major Daly from National Guard. When he reached the police station at 12:05, he instructed the white mob that helped maintain order if they followed his instructions. He formed patrols of 20 men led by servicemen and told them to gather up the Negroes but only fire to protect life. Even if he wanted to restore order, he didn't have the manpower because it was 5,000 armed white men running up and down the streets. The only chance they had was for Oklahoma militia to send a large number of troops from other parts of the state, but no one wanted to make that call for fear of looking incompetent or simply out of pride. It wasn't until 1:46 in the morning that Governor Robertson received a telegram about a race riot developing in Tulsa, and the governor didn't make the call to the National Guard until 2:14 in the morning, and it was until 5 a.m. that a special train of the Oklahoma militia left Oklahoma City for Tulsa. Back in Greenwood, the news of a riot was spreading very slowly, and many blacks simply went to bed. Shots were common in Tulsa, and many thought the blacks that had ventured into Tulsa would bear the brunt of this trouble. Of course, there was no Negro invasion. The group from the initial confrontation had escaped into Greenwood and had made their stand. This is where the riot moved from Tulsa to Greenwood. Shortly after midnight, gunfire erupted along the railroad tracks, which was the line of demarcation between the white and black districts. Unfortunately, Greenwood had a huge vulnerability. It was extremely vulnerable to fire. So during the battle along the tracks, several white men threw oily rags into buildings, set them on fire, and they burst into flames, with the wind doing the rest. And with that, Greenwood was ablaze. Meanwhile, in White Tulsa, the anticipation of a potentially race-motivated showdown created a weird, festive atmosphere with a mix of alcohol and guns. As the night wore on, the crowds in the street got larger, many of them with guns in one hand and a bottle in the other. Around 2 a.m., a large crowd gathered on the corner of 2nd and Lewis. A man stood up on a car, stating that men were going into daylight. They came into our town looking for trouble with guns trying to take over. They started trouble, and we will give them a finish and a night that they will never forget. Be ready to go into nigger town. Back in Greenwood, the fires had simmered. Damage was mostly contained. The shooting had all but stopped. Many blacks thought that the riot was over, and they had actually thought they might have won. They were just about to find out how wrong they were. Thank you. This has been One Mic History, and this has been a Black Wall Street episode. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon page in the description below. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.